Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the formation, watching as Captain Morrison called out names for the morning roll call. Around her, 200 of the galaxy's most elite naval officers snapped to attention as their names echoed across the parade ground of Titan Station. The early morning light of Saturn cast long shadows between the assembled crews, each one representing the finest military minds from across human space. "Anderson, James," Morrison's voice boomed. "Present, sir." The response came sharp and crisp. "Blackwood, Marcus." "Present, sir." Sarah shifted slightly, adjusting her perfectly pressed uniform. Her medals caught the artificial sunlight streaming through the station's massive viewing ports. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and the rarely awarded Medal of Valor gleamed against the dark fabric. But as Morrison continued down the alphabetical list, she noticed something troubling. "Carter, Diana." "Present, sir." "Davidson, Robert." "Present, sir." The captain's voice carried past the C's, through the D's, and kept going. Sarah's jaw tightened as the realization hit her. She wasn't being called. After 3 hours of travel from the outer rim, after submitting all her credentials and security clearances, after being personally invited to this joint military exercise, her name was somehow missing from the roll call. "Foster Benjamin." "Present, sir." "Garcia, Elena." "Present, sir." The other officers began shifting uncomfortably as they noticed the pattern. Some glanced towards Sarah with confusion, others with barely concealed amusement. She had seen this before, too many times to count. The quiet assumption that she didn't belong, that her presence was somehow a mistake or a clerical error. "Henderson, Michael." "Present, sir." Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral despite the growing murmur from the assembled officers. 23 years of naval service had taught her patience. 23 years of being the only woman in countless rooms full of men had taught her when to speak and when to wait. This was a time to wait. "Johnson, Patricia." "Present, sir." "Knight, David." "Present, sir." The alphabetical progression continued past the K's, through the L's and M's, moving steadily toward the end without any acknowledgement of her existence. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations starting among the junior officers. The kind of cruel gossip that followed administrative mistakes, or what people assumed were administrative mistakes. "Maybe she's not supposed to be here," someone whispered. "Probably got her orders mixed up," another voice added with a snicker. "I heard they're getting desperate for warm bodies on the outer rim assignments." Sarah's hands remained clasped behind her back, but her knuckles went white. She had commanded 3 different starships, led successful operations against pirate fleets that had terrorized shipping lanes for years, and developed tactical innovations that were now taught at the Naval Academy. But none of that seemed to matter when faced with the simple act of having her name skipped on a piece of paper. "Mitchell, Robert." "Present, sir." "Newman, Sarah." Sarah's attention snapped back to the roll call. But the name called wasn't hers. Sarah Newman was a lieutenant junior grade from the Communications Division, a competent officer, but decades younger and with a fraction of Sarah Chen's experience. "Present, sir," Newman called out. "O'Brien, Thomas." "Present, sir." The whispers behind her grew louder. Some of the officers were now openly staring, pointing, and discussing her presence as if she were an interesting anomaly rather than a fellow naval officer. The kind of attention she had spent years learning to ignore, but which still stung every single time. "Parker, William." "Present, sir." "Quinn, Jessica." "Present, sir." Sarah caught the eye of Commander Torres, an old friend from her academy days. He looked embarrassed and angry on her behalf, but she gave him a slight shake of her head. This wasn't his battle to fight. An intervention from a well-meaning colleague would only make things worse. It would confirm what many of these officers already suspected, that she needed special help or protection to function in their world. "Reynolds, Christopher." "Present, sir." "Smith, Daniel." Present, sir. The roll call was nearing its end, moving through the S's toward the inevitable conclusion where Captain Morrison would dismiss the formation without ever acknowledging her presence. Sarah had endured this kind of slight before, but never at such a high-profile gathering. This joint exercise was supposed to showcase the best and brightest of the human naval forces, a demonstration of unity and capability in the face of growing tensions with alien powers at the galaxy's edge. Thompson, Lisa. Present, sir. Valdez, Carlos. Present, sir. Behind her, the conversations were becoming less discreet. Officers who had never met her before were making assumptions about how she had gotten here, what connections she must have used, what favors had been called in. The familiar sting of being judged not by her record, but by her appearance, was something she had hoped to leave behind after reaching the rank of lieutenant commander. White, Benjamin. Present, sir. Wilson, David. Present, sir. Captain Morrison paused, shuffling through his papers one final time before looking up at the assembled formation. His eyes swept across the rows of officers, seeming satisfied with what he saw. The morning briefing was about to begin, covering the details of the 3-day joint exercise that would test their tactical abilities against simulated alien fleet movements. Yang. Michael! Present, sir. Morrison closed his folder with a sharp snap that echoed across the parade ground. Formation! Attention! He barked. 200 officers snapped into perfect alignment, their movements synchronized through years of military training. Officers, you represent the finest naval minds in human space, Morrison began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. Over the next 3 days, you will be tested in ways designed to push your tactical thinking to its absolute limits. You will face scenarios based on real intelligence gathered from our encounters with hostile alien forces at the frontier. Sarah listened to the briefing with growing frustration. She had been personally involved in several of those encounters, had developed some of the counter-tactics that were now being used to train other officers, but according to the official record of this formation, she wasn't even present to hear about them. The exercise will begin at 800 hours tomorrow, Morrison continued. You will be divided into battle groups of 20 officers each, with senior commanders taking leadership roles based on experience and demonstrated capability. Group assignments will be posted in 1 hour. As Morrison outlined the details of the exercise structure, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about being missed on a roll call. If her name wasn't on the official roster, she wouldn't be assigned to any battle group. She would be excluded from the entire exercise, sent back to her previous assignment with a polite explanation about clerical errors and bureaucratic confusion. Each battle group will be responsible for defending a sector of space against increasingly sophisticated attack patterns, Morrison explained. The alien tactical data we've gathered suggests they favor complex, multi-layered approaches that require innovative thinking to counter effectively. Sarah knew those attack patterns intimately. She had faced them in real combat, not just in simulations. Her ship, the UES Defiance, had been part of the fleet that first encountered the new alien tactical doctrine at the Battle of Kepler Station. Her analysis of their movement patterns had been crucial in developing the defensive strategies that were now standard throughout the fleet. Failure in these exercises is not just acceptable, it's expected, Morrison continued. We are dealing with alien intelligence that thinks differently than we do, that approaches warfare with assumptions and strategies we're still learning to understand. The goal is not to win every engagement, but to learn and adapt quickly enough to survive. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was an exercise designed to test adaptive thinking and innovative approaches, and she was being excluded because someone had forgotten to put her name on a list. The kind of rigid bureaucratic thinking that the exercise was supposedly designed to overcome. Officers will be evaluated not just on tactical success, but on leadership ability, creative problem-solving, and grace under pressure, Morrison announced. The top performers will be recommended for advanced command positions in the frontier fleets, where these skills are desperately needed. That got Sarah's attention. Frontier fleet command positions were exactly what she had been working toward for years. The Outer Rim was where the real action was happening, where human space met the unknown dangers of the galaxy's edge. It was dangerous, demanding work that required the best officers the Navy had to offer. Group assignments will be made by senior staff based on service records, specialized training, and command experience, Morrison said. We have reviewed every file thoroughly to ensure optimal team composition. Except they hadn't reviewed her file at all because, according to their records, she didn't exist. Sarah felt a familiar anger building, the same frustration that had driven her through decades of proving herself over and over again to people who seemed determined to overlook her achievements. "Are there any questions before we begin?" Morrison asked, his eyes scanning the formation. Sarah stepped forward slightly, preparing to speak up. This was her moment to address the oversight, to politely but firmly establish her presence and demand her rightful place in the exercise. But as she opened her mouth, a commotion erupted at the edge of the parade ground. "Attention!" someone shouted. "Admiral on deck!" The entire formation snapped to even more rigid attention as a figure in Admiral's dress uniform strode across the parade ground with purposeful steps. Sarah recognized him immediately. Admiral Jackson Hayes, the legendary commander of the 7th Fleet and one of the most respected tactical minds in human space. His presence here was unexpected, and his expression suggested he was not happy about something. Morrison looked genuinely surprised to see the Admiral. This was supposed to be a routine training exercise, not the kind of high-level operation that would normally require flag officer attention. But Hayes was walking directly toward the formation with the kind of determined pace that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Admiral Hayes, sir!" Morrison snapped to attention and saluted. "We weren't expecting—" Hayes returned the salute crisply, but didn't slow his approach. His eyes were scanning the formation with obvious purpose, looking for something or someone specific. When his gaze fell on Sarah, standing awkwardly at the edge of the assembled officers, his expression darkened considerably. "Captain Morrison," Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent parade ground. "I need to speak with you immediately about your roster." Morrison looked confused and slightly panicked. "Sir, if there's an issue with personnel assignments, I can review—" "There's an issue, Captain," Hayes interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "A significant one that needs immediate correction." The Admiral's presence had transformed the atmosphere completely. What had been a routine morning briefing was suddenly charged with tension and uncertainty. Every officer in the formation was straining to hear what would happen next while trying to maintain perfect military bearing. "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this in private," Morrison suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of whatever was about to unfold. "No, Captain," Hayes replied firmly. "This needs to be addressed here, now in front of everyone present." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that somehow her situation had drawn the attention of one of the Navy's most senior commanders. She had no idea how Admiral Hayes even knew she was here, let alone why he cared about a simple clerical error. But the look on his face suggested that this was about to become much more than a minor administrative oversight. The morning sun climbed higher over Titan Station as 200 of the galaxy's finest naval officers waited in perfect silence to see what would happen next. Sarah Chen remained at the edge of the formation, no longer invisible, but not yet acknowledged, caught in the moment between exclusion and whatever was coming next. Admiral Hayes stepped closer to Captain Morrison, his eyes never leaving Sarah's position at the formation's edge. The tension on the parade ground was thick enough to cut with a plasma torch, and everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after the joint exercise was forgotten. "Captain," Hayes said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the stillness, We need to discuss your understanding of who exactly you have standing in your formation today. Captain Morrison's face had gone pale as Admiral Hayes approached, his confident demeanor from the roll call evaporating like atmosphere through a hull breach. The captain glanced nervously between the Admiral and Sarah, clearly trying to understand what connection could possibly exist between a routine training exercise and the sudden appearance of one of the fleet's most senior commanders. "Admiral, sir, I'm not sure I understand," Morrison began carefully. "The roster was prepared according to standard protocols. All invited officers have been accounted for and assigned to appropriate battle groups based on their service records and specializations." Hayes stopped directly in front of Morrison, close enough that their conversation could be heard by the nearest officers, though most of the formation remained too far away to catch the details. His expression was the kind of controlled anger that veteran officers recognized as far more dangerous than any shouting or dramatic display. "All officers, Captain," Hayes asked quietly. "You're certain about that?" Morrison's eyes darted toward his paperwork, then back to the Admiral. "Yes, sir. 200 officers from across the fleet, all confirmed present and accounted for. The morning briefing proceeded exactly as scheduled." "Interesting," Hayes replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Because according to my records, you should have 201 officers present today. It seems you're missing someone." The whispered conversations that had been circulating through the formation during the roll call suddenly stopped completely. Every officer was straining to hear what was happening, sensing that something significant was unfolding but unable to catch all the details. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Morrison frantically checked his papers again. "Sir, I've reviewed the roster multiple times," Morrison said, his voice beginning to crack slightly under the pressure. "Everyone who was invited and confirmed is present. If there's been some kind of administrative error—" "There has indeed been an administrative error, Captain," Hayes confirmed, "but not the kind you're thinking." Admiral Hayes stepped past Morrison and began walking slowly along the edge of the formation, his eyes scanning the assembled officers with obvious purpose. When he reached Sarah's position, he stopped and turned to face the entire formation, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. "Officers," Hayes announced, "I need to address an oversight that occurred during this morning's roll call. An oversight that reflects poorly on our attention to detail and respect for fellow service members." 200 heads turned slightly toward the Admiral, though military discipline kept them facing forward. The tension was thick enough that Sarah could practically feel it pressing against her from all sides. She remained perfectly still, uncertain whether she should step forward, speak up, or continue waiting for someone else to resolve the situation. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen," Hayes called out clearly. "Please step forward." Sarah felt every eye in the formation turning toward her as she moved 3 paces forward and snapped to attention. The whispered speculation from earlier had given way to intense curiosity as officers tried to understand why an admiral would personally intervene in what appeared to be a simple roster mistake. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," Hayes continued, addressing her directly while his voice remained audible to the entire formation. "Can you confirm for everyone present your current assignment and command status?" Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea where this was leading, but Hayes clearly had a specific purpose in mind. "Sir, I am currently assigned as commanding officer of the UES Defiance, Frontier Fleet Division 7, Outer Rim Patrol Sector." A murmur ran through the formation. The Outer Rim assignments were known throughout the fleet as the most dangerous and demanding posts available. Officers assigned there were typically the most experienced and capable, dealing with threats that ranged from organized pirate fleets to increasingly hostile alien contacts. "And can you share with everyone your mission status over the past 18 months?" Hayes asked. "Sir, the Defiance has been conducting deep patrol operations along the Kepler-Vega corridor, monitoring alien fleet movements and responding to distress calls from civilian shipping." How many hostile contacts has your ship engaged during that period? Sarah hesitated briefly. The actual number was classified, but Hayes was clearly building toward something specific. 17 confirmed hostile engagements, sir. Multiple fleet actions against organized pirate groups and other entities. The other entities were the alien forces that had been probing human space with increasing frequency. Everyone in the formation knew about the growing tensions at the frontier, but few had direct experience with the new threats that were emerging from the galaxy's unexplored regions. And the outcome of those engagements? Hayes pressed. No losses to friendly forces, sir. All objectives achieved with minimal damage to civilian infrastructure. Another murmur ran through the formation, louder this time. 17 successful engagements without losses was an exceptional record, especially in the chaotic environment of the Outer Rim, where backup was often days or weeks away. Captain Morrison was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he began to realize that he had somehow overlooked an officer with an impressive combat record. But Hayes wasn't finished with his questions. Lieutenant Commander Chen, can you describe your involvement in the development of the current tactical doctrines being used for this exercise? Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was getting into areas that were well above the clearance level of most officers present. Sir, the Defiance was part of the task force that first encountered the new alien tactical patterns. My ship's tactical analysis contributed to the development of current counter-strategies. Contributed, Hayes repeated with obvious emphasis. That's a modest way to describe writing the foundational tactical manual that every officer here will be using for the next 3 days. The impact of this revelation rippled through the formation like a shockwave. Officers began glancing at each other with obvious surprise and confusion. Sarah Chen hadn't just been excluded from the exercise. They had excluded the person whose tactical innovations formed the basis for everything they were about to learn. Hayes turned back toward Captain Morrison, his expression making it clear that explanations would be required. Captain, can you help me understand how the officer who developed the tactical framework for this entire exercise somehow didn't make it onto your roster? Morrison's face was now definitely pale, and sweat was beginning to show on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Sir, there must have been some kind of communication error. Lieutenant Commander Chen's assignment was never forwarded to my office. I had no indication that she was supposed to be included in the exercise. No indication, Hayes repeated flatly, despite the fact that her expertise is precisely what this exercise was designed to test and refine. The Admiral turned back to address the full formation, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command experience. Officers, you are about to participate in tactical exercises based on real combat data gathered from the frontier. That data was collected and analyzed by ships like the Defiance, commanded by officers like Lieutenant Commander Chen. Sarah remained at attention, but she could feel the weight of 200 stares focused on her with new understanding. The dismissive whispers from earlier had been replaced by uncomfortable silence as officers began to grasp the magnitude of the oversight. The alien forces you will face in simulation have been encountered in actual combat by the officer standing in front of you, Hayes continued. She has faced their tactics, adapted to their strategies, and developed the countermeasures that will determine whether human space survives contact with these new threats. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Hayes let his words sink in. Sarah could see some officers looking genuinely ashamed, while others appeared angry at having been placed in such an awkward position through administrative incompetence. Captain Morrison, Hayes called out. I need you to explain to me how our most experienced frontier combat commander somehow became invisible to your planning staff. Morrison struggled for a response. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Sir, The communication channels for frontier assignments sometimes, there may have been a breakdown in the information flow. A breakdown? Hayes repeated with obvious displeasure. Or perhaps the kind of systemic oversight that we've seen before when certain officers don't fit the expected profile. The implication hung in the air like a live plasma charge. Everyone present understood what Hayes was suggesting, that Sarah had been overlooked not because of administrative error, but because someone had made assumptions about her based on factors that had nothing to do with her qualifications or experience. Hayes moved closer to Morrison, speaking quietly but ensuring his words carried to the nearest officers. "Captain, I've reviewed the communication logs. Lieutenant Commander Chen's assignment to this exercise was confirmed 3 weeks ago with proper routing through all appropriate channels. Her security clearance, travel authorizations, and quarters assignment were all processed correctly." Morrison looked genuinely confused now, rather than just embarrassed. "Sir, if that's the case, then I don't understand how she ended up standing at the edge of your formation while you called roll call without her name," Hayes finished. "That's an excellent question, Captain. One that I intend to get answered." Sarah remained perfectly still, but her mind was racing. She had assumed this was a simple clerical error, the kind of bureaucratic mistake that happened occasionally in an organization as large as the fleet. But Hayes was suggesting something more deliberate, more systematic. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," Hayes addressed her directly, "when you arrived at Titan Station yesterday, did you check in with the Exercise Coordination Office?" "Yes, sir. I reported to Commander Phillips in operations and provided all required documentation. He confirmed my assignment and provided quarters allocation." "And did Commander Phillips express any confusion about your presence or assignment?" Sarah hesitated, remembering the odd interaction she'd had with Phillips. "Sir, he seemed surprised to see me. He mentioned that my name wasn't on his preliminary roster, but confirmed that the assignment orders were valid." Hayes nodded grimly. "And yet somehow that information didn't make it to this morning's roll call preparation." The Admiral turned to scan the assembled formation, his expression thoughtful but determined. Every officer present was hanging on every word, sensing that they were witnessing something that would have implications far beyond a single training exercise. "Officers," Hayes announced, "what you are seeing here is a perfect example of why diversity of thought and experience is crucial to military effectiveness. When we allow bureaucratic assumptions to override merit and capability, we weaken our entire force." He gestured toward Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander Chen represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking and practical experience we need to face the challenges ahead. She has commanded in combat situations that most of you have only studied in theory. She has developed tactical solutions to problems that didn't exist 5 years ago." The formation remained perfectly silent, but Sarah could sense the shift in attention. Where there had been curiosity and speculation before, there was now genuine respect and interest. The officers were beginning to understand that they were in the presence of someone whose experience far exceeded what her rank might suggest. "The alien forces we face at the frontier don't care about our organizational charts or administrative procedures," Hayes continued. "They respond to competence, innovation, and the ability to adapt under pressure. These are exactly the qualities that Lieutenant Commander Chen has demonstrated consistently throughout her career." Admiral Hayes turned back to Captain Morrison one final time. "Captain, you have a choice to make. You can continue with your exercise as planned, missing the opportunity to learn from one of our most experienced frontier commanders. Or you can recognize that having Sarah Chen participate would dramatically improve the training value for every officer present." Morrison looked around nervously, clearly aware that his decision would be remembered by everyone present. The morning had started as a routine training exercise and had become something much more significant, a test of the fleet's ability to recognize and utilize its best talent regardless of preconceptions or administrative convenience. "Sir," Morrison finally responded, "Lieutenant Commander Chen is obviously welcome to participate. I'll ensure she's assigned to an appropriate leadership position immediately." Hayes nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the response. That's a start, Captain, but I think we need to consider whether the current exercise structure is really designed to take advantage of the expertise we now have available. The Admiral's words carried an implication that made several senior officers look uncomfortable. If Sarah Chen had developed the tactical framework being tested, perhaps the exercise itself needed to be restructured to better utilize her knowledge and experience. Lieutenant Commander Chen, Hayes addressed her directly, given your unique background with these tactical scenarios, would you be willing to serve not just as a participant, but as a senior advisor to the exercise staff? Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized the full implications of what was happening. In the span of 30 minutes, she had gone from being excluded from the exercise entirely to being offered a senior leadership role that would put her at the center of everything. "Yes, sir," she replied firmly. "I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity best serves the training objectives." Admiral Hayes smiled for the first time since his arrival. "Excellent. Captain Morrison, I believe you have some roster adjustments to make." The morning sun was now fully up over Titan Station, casting the parade ground in bright light that seemed to illuminate more than just the physical space. 200 officers remained at attention, but the atmosphere had completely transformed from routine training to something much more significant, a demonstration of how quickly assumptions could be challenged and corrected when the right leadership was involved. Sarah Chen stood a little straighter, no longer invisible, no longer an afterthought, but still not quite sure how this remarkable morning would ultimately unfold. Admiral Hayes stepped closer to the center of the formation, his expression becoming more serious as he prepared to address the assembled officers directly. The morning had already been full of surprises, but something in his demeanor suggested that the most important revelations were yet to come. "Officers," Hayes began, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, "I need to share some information that will change how you understand both this exercise and the current strategic situation facing human space." Captain Morrison looked increasingly nervous as he realized that whatever Admiral Hayes was about to reveal was well beyond anything he had been prepared to handle. The routine training exercise was rapidly becoming something much more significant and potentially classified. 48 hours ago, Hayes continued, our deep space monitoring stations detected a massive alien fleet movement along the frontier. Intelligence analysis suggests this represents the largest coordinated alien military action we have ever encountered. The threat level has been elevated to code orange throughout the outer rim sectors. A collective intake of breath rippled through the formation. Code orange was the second highest threat level, indicating imminent danger to human civilian populations and military installations. Most of the officers present had never served under anything higher than Code Yellow, and the implications were immediately clear. The tactical patterns you will be studying during this exercise are not historical curiosities, Hayes explained. They represent active intelligence gathered from ongoing alien reconnaissance operations. The scenarios you will face are based on projected attack patterns that our analysts believe will be implemented within the next 30 days. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a training exercise, it was an emergency preparation for actual combat operations that might be launched at any moment. Furthermore, Hayes continued, Fleet Command has determined that the officers participating in this exercise may be called upon to implement what they learn here in actual combat situations within weeks of completion. The performance evaluations you receive will directly impact emergency deployment assignments to the frontier. The weight of this revelation settled over the formation like a heavy blanket. What had seemed like an opportunity for career advancement had suddenly become preparation for potentially life-or-death combat operations against an alien enemy whose capabilities were still largely unknown. Admiral Hayes turned his attention back to Captain Morrison. Captain, given this elevated threat level, I need to ask you some very specific questions about how you've structured this exercise. Morrison straightened. clearly aware that his answers would determine much more than just the success of a training program. "Yes, sir. I'm ready to address any concerns." "How many of the officers in your formation have actual combat experience against alien forces using these new tactical patterns?" Morrison hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Sir, I would need to review individual service records to provide an accurate count, but I believe most officers here have some level of combat experience." "I didn't ask about general combat experience, Captain," Hayes interrupted. "I asked specifically about contact with these new alien tactical doctrines." The captain's discomfort was obvious as he realized he didn't know the answer to what was clearly a crucial question. "Sir, that level of detail wasn't part of our standard personnel screening for this exercise." Hayes nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Lieutenant Commander Chen, can you answer that question?" Sarah stepped forward slightly. "Sir, based on the service records I'm familiar with, I estimate fewer than 10 officers in this formation have direct experience with the new alien patterns. Most frontier contact has been limited to small-scale engagements with individual ships or small formations." "And how many have commanded vessels in major fleet actions against these forces?" Sarah's answer was immediate and sobering. "3, sir. Possibly 4 if you count the action at Rigel Station, but that was more of a running engagement than a fleet battle." The implications of this exchange were becoming clear to everyone present. They were preparing for combat against an enemy that almost none of them had ever faced, using tactics developed by someone who had been excluded from the exercise entirely. Admiral Hayes turned to address the full formation again. "Officers, I need you to understand something that goes to the heart of military effectiveness. The person standing at the edge of your formation has more relevant combat experience than the rest of you combined. She has faced these enemies, learned their patterns, and developed the countermeasures that may determine whether human space survives the coming conflict." He gestured toward Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander Chen isn't just another participant in this exercise. She is quite possibly the most qualified tactical officer in the entire fleet when it comes to the specific threats we now face." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Every officer present was grappling with the realization that their assumptions about hierarchy, experience, and authority had been completely wrong. "Captain Morrison," Hayes continued, "I want you to explain to me how the exercise command structure you've established takes advantage of this expertise." Morrison looked genuinely confused. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Lieutenant Commander Chen would be assigned to a battle group like any other participant, where her experience would certainly be valuable." "Assigned to a battle group," Hayes repeated with obvious displeasure. "As a subordinate participant, taking orders from officers who have never faced the enemies she has fought dozens of times." The captain's face went pale as he began to understand the magnitude of his oversight. "Sir, if you're suggesting that the command structure should be modified—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Captain," Hayes replied firmly. "I'm telling you that your current plan is strategically incompetent and potentially dangerous to every officer who will participate." The harshness of this assessment sent a visible shock through the formation. Admiral Hayes was essentially declaring that the entire exercise structure was fundamentally flawed, and that the officer in charge had failed to recognize the most important resource available to him. Hayes turned to face Sarah directly. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, I have a question for you. If you were designing a training exercise to prepare these officers for combat against the alien forces you've encountered, how would you structure it?" Sarah felt every eye in the formation focused on her as she considered her response. This was clearly a test of some kind, but she wasn't sure whether Hayes wanted her to demonstrate tactical knowledge, diplomatic skills, or something else entirely. "Sir," she began carefully, "the alien forces use coordination patterns that are fundamentally different from human tactical doctrine. They rely on collective decision-making processes that allow for rapid adaptation during combat. Traditional hierarchical command structures often prove too rigid to respond effectively. Hayes nodded encouragingly. Continue. An effective training program would need to emphasize flexible response patterns, cross-functional team coordination, and the ability to implement tactical changes in real time based on enemy adaptation. The current structure of fixed battle groups with predetermined leadership might not provide the right kind of preparation. What would you recommend instead? Sarah took a deep breath, aware that her answer would be heard by 200 senior officers who might soon be implementing whatever she suggested. Dynamic command rotation, sir. Officers would need to practice taking and relinquishing command authority based on changing tactical requirements rather than predetermined rank structure. The murmur that ran through the formation was distinctly uncomfortable. What Sarah was describing challenged fundamental assumptions about military hierarchy and chain of command that formed the basis of their entire training. Admiral Hayes smiled grimly. An interesting perspective, Lieutenant Commander, and one that happens to align exactly with the recommendations coming out of Fleet Strategic Planning. He turned back to Captain Morrison. Captain, I'm implementing an immediate change to the exercise structure. Lieutenant Commander Chen will serve as Chief Tactical Advisor with authority to modify scenarios and command structures as needed to maximize training effectiveness. Morrison looked stunned. Sir, with respect, that represents a complete departure from approved exercise protocols? Yes, it does, Hayes confirmed. Because approved exercise protocols were developed before we understood what we're actually facing out there. The Admiral raised his voice to address the entire formation. Officers, I need you to understand that everything is changing. The enemy we face doesn't respect our rank structure, our protocols, or our assumptions about how warfare is supposed to work. They adapt faster than we do, they coordinate better than we do, and they learn from every encounter. He gestured toward Sarah. Lieutenant Commander Chen has been fighting this enemy for 18 months. She has learned how they think, how they adapt, and how they can be beaten. Every officer in this formation needs to understand that she may know more about keeping you alive than anyone else present. Hayes stepped directly in front of the formation, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. From this moment forward, Lieutenant Commander Chen has my complete confidence and support. Her tactical recommendations will be implemented immediately and without question. Any officer who has concerns about taking guidance from someone whose combat experience exceeds their own is welcome to explain those concerns to me personally. The challenge was clear and unmistakable. Admiral Hayes was putting his own reputation behind Sarah's authority, making it clear that any resistance would be taken as a direct challenge to his judgment. Furthermore, Hayes continued, I am modifying the evaluation criteria for this exercise. Officers will be assessed not just on tactical performance, but on their ability to learn from unconventional sources and adapt to changing authority structures. The frontier doesn't offer the luxury of rigid hierarchy. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she realized the full scope of what was happening. In the span of an hour, she had gone from being excluded from the exercise to being placed in effective command of it with the backing of one of the fleet's most senior admirals. Admiral Hayes turned to her one final time. Lieutenant Commander Chen, I have one more question for you. Are you prepared to take operational command of this exercise and ensure that these officers receive the training they need to survive what's coming? Sarah straightened to her full height, feeling the attention of 200 officers focused on her with new understanding and respect. Yes, sir. I am ready to serve. Outstanding, Hayes replied. Captain Morrison, you will provide Lieutenant Commander Chen with whatever support and resources she requires. The exercise begins now, under her direction. He stepped back and addressed the formation one final time. Officers, you came here expecting a routine training exercise. Instead, you are receiving preparation that may save your lives and the lives of everyone under your command. Lieutenant Commander Chen will teach you things that cannot be learned from textbooks or simulations because she has learned them in actual combat." Hayes paused, allowing his words to sink in completely. "No one moves from this formation until Lieutenant Commander Chen has issued her initial tactical briefing. No one returns to quarters until she approves the new exercise structure. This is no longer Captain Morrison's exercise. It is now Lieutenant Commander Chen's operation, with my full authority behind every decision she makes." The morning sun reached its peak above Titan Station as 200 of the fleet's finest officers remained perfectly still, waiting for the woman who had been ignored at roll call to tell them how to prepare for a war that might begin at any moment. Sarah Chen stepped forward to address her new command, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but carrying the weight of human space's survival on her shoulders. Admiral Hayes smiled with grim satisfaction as he watched Sarah take command of the situation that just hours before had excluded her entirely. The irony wasn't lost on him. The exercise designed to test adaptive leadership had just received the most important lesson it could offer, and it had come not from any planned scenario, but from recognizing the value of the person they had almost lost to bureaucratic blindness. "Lieutenant Commander," Hayes said quietly as he prepared to leave the formation in her capable hands, "show them what they need to know." Sarah nodded once, then turned to face 200 officers who were finally ready to learn from someone who had already fought tomorrow's war and lived to teach them how to win it.